Historical records indicate that the Ottoman Imperial Harem was not merely a secluded domestic space, but a highly structured institution embedded within the political and administrative framework of the empire. Contrary to popular imagination, it functioned less as a place of idle luxury and more as a regulated system of hierarchy, discipline, and controlled mobility. Within its walls, concubines occupied a defined position shaped by legal norms, economic considerations, and court protocol. Surviving documents suggest that most concubines entered the harem through systems of enslavement that were, at the time, formalized and widely practiced across the empire. Many were acquired through the Black Sea slave trade, originating from regions such as Circassia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. Others were brought through diplomatic exchanges or internal markets. Upon entry, they were stripped of previous social identities and integrated into a new institutional order that prioritized obedience, training, and assimilation. Contemporary accounts describe the initial phase of a concubine's life in the harem as one of intensive education and evaluation. Young women were placed under the supervision of senior attendants and eunuchs, where they were trained in language, court etiquette, religious practice, music, and domestic skills. The intention was not only to prepare them for potential proximity to the sultan, but also to ensure their functionality within the broader palace system. Discipline was strict, and movement was tightly controlled. Infractions could result in reassignment, punishment, or permanent exclusion from advancement. The structure of the harem itself was hierarchical and bureaucratic. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, whose authority extended over internal governance, financial distribution, and personnel management. Beneath her existed a ranking system among women that determined status, privileges, and influence. Concubines began at the lowest tier, often referred to in archival material as novices or attendants, and could rise through the ranks depending on favor, conduct, and circumstance. Legal codes of the period reveal that concubines were considered enslaved persons, yet their status diverged in significant ways from laborers outside the palace. They were provided with housing, clothing, and sustenance within the imperial complex, and in many cases received stipends. However, these provisions existed within a framework of ownership. Their autonomy was limited, and their futures were largely determined by the decisions of palace authorities. Chroniclers noted that advancement within the harem was neither guaranteed nor common. Only a small fraction of concubines ever entered into the sultan's immediate circle. Selection processes were opaque, influenced by physical appearance, perceived intelligence, and the recommendations of senior figures within the harem. Those who attracted the attention of the sultan could be elevated to the status of favored consort, a position that carried both privilege and risk. For concubines who bore children to the sultan, their status changed significantly. Historical records indicate that motherhood conferred a degree of security and influence not accessible to others. A concubine who gave birth to a son, in particular, entered a new political reality. She became part of a dynastic structure in which her child's future potential as a ruler directly affected her own standing. Yet this elevation also placed her within a system of intense competition and surveillance. The lived reality of these women was shaped by both opportunity and constraint. While some rose to positions of considerable influence, the majority remained within lower ranks, performing domestic and administrative duties without direct interaction with the sultan. Their daily routines were regulated by schedules, overseen by officials, and confined within architectural boundaries designed to enforce separation from the outside world. Architectural studies of the imperial palace suggest that the harem was physically isolated, yet internally complex. Corridors, courtyards, and chambers were arranged to facilitate supervision and limit unauthorized movement. Eunuchs, particularly those assigned to the harem, played a central role in maintaining this order. They acted as intermediaries between the inner quarters and the external administration, controlling access and enforcing discipline. Surviving financial records indicate that the harem operated with a defined budget, allocated through the imperial treasury. Resources were distributed according to rank, with higher-status women receiving greater allowances and accommodations. This economic structure reinforced the hierarchy and created material incentives for compliance and advancement. At the same time, the system imposed limitations that extended beyond physical confinement. Concubines were prohibited from forming external relationships, and communication with the outside world was restricted. Their identities were reshaped to align with palace expectations, including conversion to Islam and adoption of new names. This process effectively severed ties to their origins, integrating them fully into the imperial system. Contemporary observers, including foreign diplomats, often describe the harem through a lens of curiosity and speculation. However, their accounts were frequently limited by restricted access and cultural distance. More reliable insights emerge from internal records and legal documents, which present a picture of a regulated institution governed by rules rather than excess or chaos. The mechanisms of control within the harem were multifaceted. Surveillance was constant, reinforced by both physical oversight and social expectations. Advancement depended not only on personal attributes, but also on the ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. Alliances, rivalries, and patronage networks developed within the confines of the institution, influencing outcomes in ways that were not always visible in official records. Despite these constraints, some concubines exercised agency within the system. Historical cases demonstrate that women who attained higher ranks could influence appointments, advocate for their children, and participate indirectly in political decision-making. Yet such instances were exceptions rather than the norm, and they depended heavily on proximity to power. The broader implications of the harem system extended beyond the individuals within it. It played a role in dynastic continuity, ensuring a controlled environment for the production and upbringing of potential heirs. It also reflected the empire's approach to governance, where centralized authority was maintained through structured institutions and regulated social hierarchies. Over time, the system evolved in response to internal and external pressures. Changes in succession practices, administrative reforms, and shifting political priorities affected the operation of the harem and the experiences of those within it. Nevertheless, the fundamental characteristics of hierarchy, control, and limited mobility remained consistent across centuries. The reality of life for concubines in the Ottoman Imperial Harem was therefore defined by a combination of institutional discipline and constrained opportunity. While the possibility of advancement existed, it was accessible to few and contingent upon factors beyond individual control. For most, life within the harem consisted of regulated routines, restricted autonomy, and a gradual adaptation to a system designed to serve the needs of the state rather than the aspirations of the individual. Surviving documents suggest that once a concubine moved beyond the initial phase of training, her position within the harem became increasingly defined by routine, surveillance, and the gradual internalization of institutional expectations. Daily life was not characterized by unpredictability, but by repetition. Records of palace administration indicate that time was structured around prayers, instruction, assigned labor, and supervised leisure, all occurring within carefully regulated spaces. Movement between chambers required permission, and access to certain areas was determined strictly by rank. The presence of the eunuch corps was central to maintaining this order. Contemporary accounts describe two primary groups: the black eunuchs, who served within the harem itself, and the white eunuchs, who operated in other sections of the palace. The chief black eunuch held a position of considerable authority, acting as both gatekeeper and administrator. His responsibilities included enforcing rules, overseeing discipline, and managing communication between the harem and the outside political sphere. Archival material indicates that this role extended beyond supervision into influence, as the chief black eunuch could shape which messages reached the sultan and which did not. Within this controlled environment, relationships among concubines were shaped by hierarchy and proximity to power. Chroniclers noted that competition was a persistent feature of life in the harem, though it rarely manifested in overt conflict. Instead, it operated through subtle forms of positioning, including the cultivation of favor with senior women, adherence to expected conduct, and demonstration of loyalty. Advancement required not only compliance, but also an ability to navigate these internal dynamics without attracting negative attention. Legal codes of the period reveal that discipline within the harem was formalized, though not always documented in detail. Punishments for violations of protocol could include demotion, reassignment to less desirable duties, or in some cases removal from the palace altogether. More severe consequences, while less frequently recorded, were not absent from the system. The emphasis on order was consistent with broader Ottoman administrative practices, where stability and predictability were prioritized over individual expression. For concubines who never entered the sultan's immediate circle, life followed a more predictable trajectory. Many remained within service roles for extended periods, contributing to the maintenance of the palace through tasks related to textiles, food preparation, education of younger entrants, and general domestic management. Financial registers indicate that these women received regular stipends, scaled according to seniority and function. Over time, some could attain mid-level ranks that provided modest privileges, including improved living quarters and greater autonomy within defined limits. One of the more significant transitions documented in archival sources was the process of manumission. Under certain conditions, concubines could be granted their freedom, often after a period of service or upon reaching a certain age. This practice aligned with Islamic legal principles that encouraged the emancipation of enslaved individuals under specific circumstances. However, manumission did not necessarily equate to complete independence. Many former concubines remained connected to the palace through patronage networks, marriages arranged by court authorities, or continued service in less restrictive roles. Marriage, in particular, functioned as a mechanism of both reward and control. Historical records indicate that concubines who did not become consorts of the sultan were sometimes married to officials, soldiers, or administrators within the imperial system. These unions were typically arranged by the Valide sultan or other senior figures, ensuring that the women remained within a network loyal to the court. In this way, the harem extended its influence beyond its physical boundaries, integrating former members into the broader administrative fabric of the empire. For those who bore children to the sultan, the trajectory diverged significantly. The principle often described in modern scholarship as one mother, one son, shaped the reproductive politics of the harem. While not an absolute rule, historical patterns indicate that concubines who gave birth to a son were less likely to have additional children with the sultan. This practice limited the concentration of maternal influence and distributed potential claimants across different maternal lines. As a result, each mother-son pair became a distinct unit within the dynastic structure. The upbringing of princes introduced another layer of complexity. Contemporary accounts describe a system in which young princes were initially raised within the harem under the supervision of their mothers and appointed tutors. At a certain age, they were sent to provincial governorships as part of their administrative training. Their mothers often accompanied them, effectively transitioning from the seclusion of the harem to a more visible role in provincial life. This relocation altered the conditions of daily existence, replacing strict confinement with a different form of responsibility tied to governance. However, this system also carried inherent risks. The absence of a fixed succession law meant that the death of a sultan could trigger competition among his sons. Historical records of succession crises indicate that outcomes were often decisive and at times violent. The position of a concubine mother was therefore closely tied to the fortunes of her son. Success could elevate her to the highest rank within the empire, while failure could result in marginalization or worse. In later periods, particularly from the 17th century onward, changes in succession practices altered these dynamics. The practice of sending princes to provincial posts declined, and confinement within the palace became more common. This shift, sometimes referred to in historical literature as the cage system, kept potential heirs within controlled environments to prevent rebellion, but also limited their administrative experience. For concubine mothers, this meant prolonged residence within the palace and a different form of uncertainty regarding their children's futures. Economic records from this period indicate an expansion of the harem's internal economy. Increased stipends, more elaborate consumption patterns, and greater numbers of personnel suggest that the institution grew in scale and complexity. Yet this expansion did not fundamentally alter the conditions of control. Surveillance remained constant, and access to power continued to depend on proximity to key figures such as the Valide Sultan and the chief black eunuch. The emotional realities of concubine life are less directly documented, but certain patterns can be inferred from the structure itself. The combination of restricted movement, competitive hierarchy, and uncertain futures likely produced a range of responses, from adaptation and acceptance to anxiety and strategic calculation. While personal testimonies are scarce, the consistency of institutional practices across records suggests that individual experiences were shaped more by systemic conditions than by isolated events. Foreign observers occasionally attempted to describe these conditions, but their accounts were often influenced by limited access and preconceived notions. More reliable evidence emerges from Ottoman archival material, which, while administrative in nature, provides insight into the functioning of the system. These records emphasize order, hierarchy, and continuity, offering little indication of the more sensationalized narratives that later emerged in popular representations. Over time, the role of concubines within the imperial structure became increasingly formalized. Their presence was not incidental, but integral to the operation of the dynasty. They contributed to the reproduction of the ruling line, the maintenance of the palace, and the extension of influence through arranged marriages and patronage networks. At the same time, their lives remained circumscribed by rules that prioritized the stability of the state over personal autonomy. The Ottoman Imperial Harem thus functioned as a controlled environment where governance, domestic life, and dynastic strategy intersected. For concubines, existence within this system required continuous adaptation to shifting expectations and conditions. Advancement was possible but uncertain, and even those who achieved higher status remained subject to the same underlying structures of authority. Historical records indicate that in the later centuries of the Ottoman Empire, the structure of the imperial harem continued to evolve, but its foundational principles of hierarchy, regulation, and political integration remained intact. Even as broader imperial institutions underwent administrative reform, the harem persisted as a controlled domestic and dynastic space, closely tied to the legitimacy of the ruling house. The position of concubines within this system was shaped increasingly by long-term residence, institutional memory, and the consolidation of internal power networks rather than sudden advancement or abrupt social mobility. Surviving documents suggest that by the 18th and 19th centuries, the composition of the harem had become more stable, with fewer new entrants compared to earlier periods. This shift reflected both changes in imperial procurement practices and evolving international pressures that gradually reduced the visibility of large-scale slave acquisition. Nevertheless, the institution still relied on the continued presence of enslaved women, who were integrated into the palace after undergoing conversion and re-identification within the court system. Their original identities were systematically replaced through naming conventions, religious instruction, and strict behavioral codes that aligned them with imperial expectations. Contemporary accounts describe the harem during this period as a deeply structured administrative environment, where senior women held defined offices with specific responsibilities. The hierarchy among concubines was no longer solely dependent on proximity to the sultan, but also on accumulated experience, seniority, and institutional trust. Positions such as Kalfa and USTA indicated levels of authority within the internal workforce, granting certain women oversight over training, discipline, and logistical organization. These roles demonstrate that the harem operated not only as a domestic space, but also as a self-contained bureaucratic system. Chroniclers noted that the Valide Sultan's authority remained central throughout these later developments. She functioned as both symbolic matriarch and practical administrator, controlling financial resources, personnel appointments, and internal discipline. Her influence extended beyond the harem into broader state affairs, particularly during periods when sultans were inexperienced, politically constrained, or otherwise dependent on court factions. In such contexts, the harem's internal hierarchy could exert indirect but meaningful influence on imperial governance. Legal codes and financial registers from the period reveal increasing regularization of stipends, allowances, and retirement provisions for women of the harem. Long-serving concubines who did not achieve consort status could still attain a form of institutional retirement, often provided with housing outside the palace or pensions funded by imperial endowments. These arrangements reflect the degree to which the harem had become embedded within the fiscal and legal structures of the empire. Yet even in retirement, former members often remained socially and economically connected to palace networks, reinforcing the long-term reach of the institution. Within the palace itself, daily life remained governed by strict routines. Contemporary sources describe a rhythm of religious observance, instruction, and supervised labor that structured time into predictable cycles. The architectural layout of the harem continued to reinforce these patterns, with segmented quarters, controlled access points, and designated zones for different ranks. Movement between spaces required authorization, and surveillance was maintained through both human oversight and architectural design. For concubines who had attained senior status, Responsibilities often included the supervision of newer entrants. This created a generational structure within the harem, where experienced women transmitted institutional knowledge and enforced discipline. Training encompassed not only practical skills, but also behavioral expectations, etiquette, and the interpretation of court hierarchy. In this way, the system reproduced itself internally, relying on its own members to sustain continuity across time. Historical records indicate that emotional expression within the harem was carefully regulated. While personal relationships undoubtedly developed, they were mediated by the constraints of hierarchy and surveillance. Bonds of mentorship or alliance could provide protection and advancement, but they also required careful navigation of institutional expectations. Open defiance or disruption of order was rare, not necessarily because of absence of sentiment, but because of the structural consequences associated with deviation from protocol. The role of eunuchs remained significant in this later period, though their functions became increasingly administrative and diplomatic in nature. The chief black eunuch, in particular, maintained a position of extraordinary influence, acting as intermediary between the harem and the highest levels of imperial authority. Archival correspondence suggests that this office was involved in the transmission of orders, the management of appointments, and the regulation of access to the sultan. In practical terms, this meant that control over communication pathways could translate into political influence.